This is Ed Buendia, and in this module we're going to cover the areas of culture, identity, and learning. And to be able to jump into this module, we are going to start off with a cautionary note, specifically trying to understand what are the precarious areas of trying to harness culture and integrate aspects of culture into our teaching. And so part of this is going to, at least at the starting point, is kind of identify some of the difficulties in terms of doing this, but yet while understanding that it's very important to our teaching practices and for our students to understand how we might be able to engage this. Second, we're going to try to grasp the concept of culture by understanding it partly through what it isn't and trying to understand how culture has been theorized in the past as kind of a counterpoint, and then try to get to what is culture and identity by doing this juxtaposition. So this counterpoint approach is going to help us kind of grasp that. Third, we're going to pick up as a way of theorizing culture is understanding culture as hybridity. So by the time we're done with this module, we should be able to understand how culture is more ideally understood as a hybrid set of processes as opposed to a list of attributes. And so that is what we want to make sure that we're able to walk away with as we begin to think about culture and identity and how it's produced. And last, we're going to understand the implications of culture on learning and try to understand what are those instances in which it has been harnessed in a very thoughtful and meaningful kind of way, and link this to some of the readings that you have this week, as well as the various videos that you have, as a way of looking at exemplars, those particular teaching practices that actually might provide us some possibility. So we want to begin this modules with the caveat of talking about the complexity of culture. It's really a challenge to be able to capture what is culture. If you think about the question of what is your culture and what are your cultural practices, many of us would be stumped to be able to talk about those elements. However, we engage in cultural practices all the time. So there's a complexity to this. And the caveat to thinking about culture and how do we harness it and integrate it into our teaching is trying to begin to think about how we are able to talk about cultural practices in all their complexity and approach any recipe or set of attribute list with a high degree of caution. Because in many respects, once we find ourselves listing culture to a list or a set of attributable categories, we're going to find ourselves in a lot of trouble. So we want to approach culture cautiously with the idea that anytime we are given a list that we can attribute what our cultural practices, we want to be cautious about that. So let's go to culture and begin to think about how we might theorize culture. But to comprehend culture, I think it's helpful if we start with kind of the counterpoint. So instead of talking about what is the main point about culture, let's kind of talk about what culture isn't. Let me give you an example. During the 1960s, 70s, as well as the 80s, you probably remember in some of your methods courses, particularly if you took a multicultural education course, we kept talking about how particular cultures had attributes. So an example would be American Indians would not look at you in the eye, and they preferred that you not touch them, and equally that American Indians had this kind of silent period in terms of verbal responses. And what was significant about this is we were given a list of attributes of what we called essential attributes. And we were told as educators that we needed to be mindful of how to be conscious of these attributes of American Indians. And so the same was kind of unfolded for many groups where we began to kind of create these essential attributes. And this essentialist thinking prevailed as kind of the predominant framework as part of the anthropological discipline. But in the 90s, as well as by about 2005 or so, the field of anthropology shifted. And it began to shift away from that particular framework of cultural as essential set of attributes and began to move towards thinking about culture as process, and specifically thinking about culture not necessarily as something that was bounded or a list of attributes, but thinking about culture as something that was much more dynamic. And so we moved away from the idea of essential attributes, and we began to think about culture and identity as hybridity. And in thinking about this idea of hybridity, culture and identity were thought more so not as things, but as a process. The way we do our sense of selves, the way we do the sense of collective identity. And so consequently, hybridity began to put into place other ways of thinking about elements such as that element of process of production, of creating selves, equally understanding what are the different resources that different groups and individuals bring to performing these social selves, particularly understanding the array of individuals caught in a matrix of different kinds of social forces. So popular cultural resources, ideological resources such as religion, class resources, which were also part of this kind of social field in which culture was produced. And all of this got to the idea that as opposed to seeing essential as durable and eternal, culture began to be thought about as dynamic. And this particular shift is the main point. And so the emphasis began to thinking about identity as much more tentative, much more shifting, as well as much more complex. As an example, in thinking about how identities are constructed and how culture is a production, if we think about the way that we as individuals in the United States are constantly engaged with these different kinds of cultural resources, self-help magazines, the way that the messages or what we may call discourses, which are those kind of statements about self, get articulated and moved into our own practices, as well as other kinds of popular media. Those become part of those processes, as well as thinking about the way that different resources that emerge from having particular kinds of economic resources available. Those are part of that production process. So all of this is tied to the idea of globalization, right? So the idea that none of this is bounded to just what's in the United States, but rather we find ourselves in what some theoreticians call these scapes or landscapes of different kinds of financial arrangements, different kinds of ideological arrangements, as well as different kinds of identity kinds of frameworks that get caught up in presented to us through media. So all of this points to the way that culture is a very dynamic process. And so consequently, thinking about culture as an essential list of attributes, we've moved away from that and are beginning to understand how is it that individuals are constantly engaged in different kinds of mediums to be able to produce these sets of social selves. So that idea of culture is going to prompt us to think about our students and the individuals within our schools in very different kinds of ways. So let's begin to think about what implications culture has on learning. And this is where rubber meets the road, right? So if we're making the argument that culture is this very complex array of practices and processes that we engage in, part of the question is, how do you harness this? Particularly, how do you, if the position that we're arguing in education is that we should access culture and use it as part of the mechanisms for trying to engage students, how do we go about doing that? Well, there's key pieces that we want to highlight here. First of all, as you can imagine, this is about engagement with youth, thinking about how we are learning from them, listening to them, and thinking about how they are using these different resources, and particularly how they are employing different resources as part of this doing of selves. And this sits in juxtaposition to our counterpoint, which is that recipe or that list of attributes. And so, consequently, what we are needing to do as educators is listen and contemplate with youth how they are thinking about selves in relationship to what they're engaged in. So, it may be the case that certain groups and individuals may rely on some elements of culture that are historical. So, one of the things we don't want to do is freeze and deglobalize our students and think of them as ahistorically. One way of doing that you're going to hear on this week's videos is thinking about project-based initiatives, particularly trying to understand how we begin to think of culture as well as lived selves in ways that help access the reality. You have two videos that are going to help you think about reality that is trying to access this cultural domain. So these project-based initiatives are awfully important in thinking about how students are producing selves, thinking about selves in the array of the social context in which they work. And what becomes significant in this conversation is the way that project and reality becomes the foreground of the educational enterprise, and the disciplinary elements are harnessed and connected to these different projects. And so that is one of the key switches that we need to keep in mind. Equally, the other piece that becomes important is thinking about different ethnic cultural initiatives. One of the readings that you have in this week is going to make the case for the idea of cocooning and the way that that might be a necessary strategy for students for being able to engage in individuals who like themselves, who have a similar worldview as well as similar experience, and who are engaged in constructing selves in a similar fashion and thinking about how those might be harnessed. And many of this idea is really controversial because at the crux of this, what we're asking is educators to permit, as well as community members, to allow this degree of self-segregation. And you see this through different kinds of initiatives in your schools, possibly. Latinos in Action is one of those initiatives that you see, where it's a college readiness program that's trying to connect students with the idea of college-bound trajectory, equally provide them with the skill set as well as outlook necessary for thinking about college. Equally, ethnic studies curriculum that you have probably read about in Arizona that has been a source of controversy. These ethnic cultural initiatives are some of the projects that are seeking to try to tap into the cultural facets of students' culture as a means of trying to enhance achievement. The caveat to this is we can't just assume that just because a student is Latino or Peruvian or Mexican American, that these particular initiatives are going to speak to them. This is where the complexity comes into play. So let's recap what we discussed in this module. First, we want to attend to a different concept of culture and think about culture in a more complex framework than what we historically have. We've jettisoned the conversation and framework of lists, so consequently now we're trying to understand culture as a process. And importantly, you want to begin to think about trying to understand how your students are making sense of the world by engaging in these selves using different cultural resources. And that process becomes the way of understanding cultural and cultural production. This has become central to thinking about identity. Secondly, we've also talked about the arguments for understanding why culture and identity should be harnessed. I want to accentuate here the idea that when we think about achievement, that achievement and cultural engagement and cultural integration becomes very important. What we know about why students leave educational institutions as well as why they are not achieving is because there's that disconnect between how they are living their lives and what they find significant and what is presented in the school and educational context. So it's important to make sure that those kinds of connections are there as a way of allowing students to find those linkages between their reality and what we value in terms of concept development and other dispositions that we civil society. Third, we also have made the argument and provided you examples through the readings as well as the videos, a different way of thinking about linking culture and identity to the educational pedagogical projects. And we've made the argument that we need to begin to think about reality pedagogies. Culturally relevant pedagogies is one of these pieces. You also heard some of you were engaged in looking at everyday pedagogies of the way that those find life in terms of certain disciplines. And it becomes important to accentuate here that what we are doing is we are actually raising the bar as opposed to thinking about cultural integration through a celebration of culture. What we're trying to do is meld cultural processes, cultural production and identity to rich concept development, to authentic learning. And so this does mean a shift in how we're thinking about harnessing and integrating culture in education places. This means we are actually going way beyond celebrating culture and diversity, but actually trying to link how is it that students' lived realities are connected to the curriculum. So that covers what we've done today.